Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really defining chapter of North American history, the Mexican-American War, which ran from 1846 to 1848. But listen, we aren't just going to rattle off dates and battles here. Instead, we're using our source material to totally reframe this event. We're going to see how looking at the exact same historical timeline, but from the other side of the border, completely shifts the narrative. We go from this familiar story of inevitable national expansion to a much darker reality of an unprovoked war of U.S. aggression aimed at stealing land, resulting in massive, deeply unfair territorial loss for the Mexican people.
Right off the bat, I want to hit you with a really powerful question, drawn straight from our sources. How does learning that an idea, like manifest destiny, was used to justify human suffering, change the way you think about national progress? That's exactly the nuanced lens we're applying today. We're going to see how one nation's proud story of progress can, at the exact same time, be another nation's history of displacement and destruction.
So, Section 1, Manifest Destiny Reframed. To really understand this conflict, we've got to define the driving force behind it. Manifest destiny. You've probably heard the term. It was this ideology claiming the United States was simply destined, like cosmically meant to be expanded all the way across North America. But as our sources point out, this wasn't just some harmless philosophy, right? It was actively used as a tool to justify the aggressive seizure of Mexican territory. Plus, it provided the ideological cover for U.S. policies that led to the forced removal, displacement, and honestly, horrific destruction of indigenous peoples across the continent.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is where the stark contrast really takes shape. On one hand, you have your standard U.S. textbook view, where this conflict is often taught as just a border dispute, or maybe a natural step in national expansion. But flip the script. From the Mexican perspective, our sources show this is widely viewed as a clear-cut, unprovoked war of U.S. aggression. To many Mexicans at the time, this wasn't just an isolated scuffle, not at all. It was part of a terrifying larger pattern of forced expansionism, specifically to steal land, completely erasing existing societies in the process.
Moving on to Section 2, Tensions over Texas.
The rapid breakdown of international relations here is wild, and it illustrates exactly how we got to this point. So after Mexico gains independence from Spain, one of the major things they do is abolish slavery in 1829. But then, just 7 years later, in 1836, Texas declares independence, and boom, by 1845, Texas officially joins the United States. So what exactly caused such extreme friction in that tiny window of time?
Well, the source text reveals something crucial. Many American settlers who had moved into Texas simply refused to comply with Mexican law, specifically that law abolishing slavery. These settlers continued to illegally bring enslaved African-descended people into Mexican territory. They were actively reshaping the entire region's economy around the institution of slavery. So you basically had settlers resisting Mexican governance specifically so they could preserve slavery, eventually pushing for separation so they could just align themselves with the United States instead.
Which really leads us to ask this incredibly relevant question. What does it suggest about conflict when people intentionally break another country's laws while still expecting to claim land and rights there? It forces you to actively engage with the sheer complexity of the time, doesn't it? The settlers were openly defying their host nation, and when Mexico pushed back, well, it set the stage for outright war.
All right, Section 3, Disputed Borders and Provocation. So we have these deeply conflicting territorial claims over the region between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. The U.S. claimed this area for Texas, while Mexico naturally considered this to be their own sovereign territory. When U.S. troops physically moved into this disputed zone, fighting broke out. And Mexican leaders viewed this, quite understandably from their perspective, as a deliberate military provocation, a totally unprovoked move designed specifically to justify further expansion and ultimately territory theft.
But the narrative in Washington, entirely different. President James K. Polk, who was a massive proponent of manifest destiny, framed the whole thing as a natural defensive necessity. He actually told Congress, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. He used this rhetoric to claim the U.S. was the victim of an unprovoked attack. It completely reversed the reality on the ground from the Mexican perspective, where U.S. troops were clearly the ones who moved in first.
Now, this fierce debate wasn't just happening between the U.S. and Mexico. It was happening right inside the United States government itself. A young senator at the time, a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln, openly questioned Polk's narrative. He pointedly asked, What does it mean that Mexico has been invaded by the sword and that their cities have been burned by our troops? Lincoln's quote imparts this great historical reality. Even top U.S. politicians recognized the frankly invasive nature of the military's actions.
Really think about that juxtaposition for a second. Can a war feel defensive to one side and totally invasive to the other at the exact same time? And what factors actually shape that difference? It shows how perspective fundamentally shifts the reality of who started it. When you have superior resources and an ideology practically screaming that the land is rightfully yours, the definition of defense gets very, very blurry.
Which brings us to Section 4, a war of occupation. So, U.S. forces utilized their vastly superior resources and organization to push incredibly deep into Mexican territory, meaning this quickly stopped being a simple border dispute and turned into a full-scale invasion and occupation of Mexico itself. The movement of these massive armies thoroughly disrupted communities. Severe supply shortages caused extreme civilian hardship, and the total breakdown of local control resulted in a foreign authority being forcefully imposed on the people.
Because for the civilians actually living through this, right, this wasn't just some abstract military conflict over invisible lines on a map. They were experiencing the sheer trauma of having a foreign authority imposed directly upon their homes. They saw a powerful, well-resourced nation using brute military force to just impose its will. It was a reality experienced as deeply, profoundly unfair to the Mexican people, completely backed by the uncompromising ideology of manifest destiny.
I really want you to empathize with this on-the-ground experience for a moment. How might daily life feel different for civilians during a war of occupation compared to how wars are usually described in history textbooks? You know, textbooks so often sanitize conflict into neat little dates and treaties. But for the people living it, it is a total, terrifying upheaval of safety, sovereignty, and daily survival.
Let's look at the aftermath in Section 5, the price of peace.
By signing the treaty that ended this war, Mexico was forced to surrender a staggering 55% of its entire territory. Think about that. More than half the country gone. We're talking about present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states. It is an almost unimaginable amount of land to lose at the conclusion of a single conflict.
And in exchange for surrendering over half their country, the United States paid Mexico $15 million. This highly unequal power dynamic essentially allowed U.S. leaders to slap a price tag on the land and frame the whole exchange as a completely standard diplomatic settlement. But as the source material makes incredibly clear, that is only one side of the story. While the U.S. called it a diplomatic settlement and this great triumph of expansion, many Mexicans viewed it simply as the result of unequal power and crushing military pressure. From the Mexican perspective, this treaty was the ultimate culmination of an unprovoked war of aggression to steal land. It was a devastating, deeply unfair loss of sovereignty fueled by manifest destiny, and carried out by leaders who pursued continental growth at Mexico's profound expense.
So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. When land changes hands after a war, who do you think gets to decide whether it was a fair deal, and why? History is so often written by the victors, but as we've seen today, examining the sources from both sides of the border reveals a much deeper, way more complex reality. Keep questioning those historical narratives, guys. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.